Hello, good evening, and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, a brand new week. Tonight is Monday night. We're beginning the week. Hope you had a wonderful weekend. David Hinds here, of course, welcoming you to Politics 101. I want to welcome all of you, wherever you're joining us from, whether you're joining us from home, meaning in Guyana, or you're joining us from the Caribbean, the Caribbean region of which Guyana is an integral part, notwithstanding those who have been trying to write us out of the Caribbean. What do they know of the Caribbean? Only the Caribbean knows. I'm paraphrasing the late, great C.L.R. James, who, when writing about cricket, asked, what do they know of cricket? Who only cricket knows. And I asked the same thing about the Caribbean. What do they know of the Caribbean? Who only the Caribbean knows. We are part of the Caribbean. We are all part of the Caribbean, whether we are Caribbean islands or we are mainland countries, Belize, Guyana, the Caribbean coast of the Central American and Northern South American countries. We are all Caribbean. The Caribbean, of course, that name was given by that man Columbus, who met the Carib tribes and named our Caribbean after the Caribs. And of course, the Caribbean has always been a regional construct, not an island construct. And so therefore, tell them we are all part of the Caribbean. Welcome to those of you who are joining us from our wider Caribbean. Those of you from North America, good evening, especially those of you on the East Coast, in the South. Some of you are joining us from Texas. Good evening to you. And how about my friends in Arizona and California, the West Coast of the United States of America? My friend, my brother, Nigel in Arizona, who is an ardent listener or viewer of this program. My brother Nigel, good evening. How about those of you out there in Canada? Good evening to you. How about my friend Colin Burke, my childhood friend? Hope you're doing well, and all of my friends out there in Canada, good evening. Good evening to my family and friends in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. Those of you in the New York tri-state area, welcome to Politics 101. It's a brand new week, so please share the link and let your friends and family know that we are on Politics 101. This week is going to be a busy week. It's going to be a busy week. Later on in the week, I'll be talking to Vincent Alexander. And then I know I'll be talking to Dr. Vince Adams. And I will be talking to GHK Lal also this week. So it's a busy week. Tonight, we want to talk a little bit about democracy. That word, that term that has been thrown around left, right, and center. You know, some people define democracy in minimalist terms, that democracy means elections. Some of us define that term in a maximalist sense, that democracy is not just about regular elections, it's about what governments do after they have been elected, what parties do after they have been elected, that how they behave in government is also part of democracy. So we talk about the democratic procedure. That is the means by which a democratic government comes into being. And then we talk about democratic practice. That is the practice of government when they're in office. And so we want to move it away, because you see, the people who are supporting this government refers to the government as a democratic one because it was elected, they say, democratically. Now we have some question marks about whether this government was democratically elected. You all know my view on that. But even if the government were democratically elected, what about the practice of that democracy? Has the government been behaving democratically over the last 3 years? These are questions we, of course, would answer over time, and we have been answering those questions over time. Now, democracy in one country does not necessarily mean the same thing in another country. Our country, of course, is a unique species. Our country is an ethnically plural country. That is, we have several ethnic groups in Guyana. And those ethnic groups are ethnic groups that are contesting for political space, for political resources. That is the consequence of our history. And so, therefore, democracy in a society with contesting ethnic groups does not necessarily look the same way as a democracy in, let's say, a homogeneous society. Europeans are generally homogeneous society, mostly what we call white people. But countries like ours, we have different ethnic groups that came to Guyana in different circumstances, and we aspire to be one nation. We aspire to be one nation. Different people coming together to form a nation. What is the best form of democracy for Guyana? That has been a question that has engaged us from the time of the decolonization period, meaning the period transitioning from colonialism to independence. We've asked the question, what form of democracy is best suited for Guyana? And Brother Yussi Kwayana, as a member of the Association for Racial Equality, ASRA, in 1961 put the formula on the table, what he called joint premiership. The African Society for Racial Equality, sorry, not association, the African Society for Racial Equality. At that time, it was the precursor to ASCRA. And they put on the table, through Guyana, joint premiership. Later became known as power sharing, and then later shared governance. And ever since then, we have been debating what is the best form of democracy. It is clear that the form of democracy that we now have, which is majoritarian democracy, has not worked well for us. And so we have to continue to search for that form of democracy that is best suited. A democracy that has democratic outcomes, not a democracy that has undemocratic outcomes. And so tonight we want to talk about that democracy. What is the best form of democracy for Guyana? And you know, I went into my archives and I found something. It was an interview I did, myself and the Honorable Rashleigh Jackson, former Foreign Minister of Guyana. regardless of one of our best diplomats. I was on a program with him, I think about 20 years ago, and we were discussing this question: what is the best form of democracy for Guyana? And it was one of those moments, you know, you come up as a little boy and there are people you look up to, and then you become a big boy and you get a chance to sit with those people. And it was one of those moments that I treasure, that I got a chance to appear on a program with Rashleigh Jackson. It was a program called Spotlight that was moderated by Grantley Walleran on Channel 9. And he had Mr. Jackson and myself on that program discussing what form of democracy is best for Guyana. And I want to share that with you tonight. I want to share those thoughts with you tonight. I want to share that interview with you tonight. So please share the link and let others know that Politics 101 is on tonight. We are discussing democracy in Guyana. What form of democracy is best for our...
Towards democracy. I think the people's experience of democracy in this country has not been a healthy one. And, you know, on the question of governance, for instance, even in today's papers, there's a letter by someone who should remain unnamed, in which he's sort of advocating the winner-take-all position. Now, it seems to me that there has developed in Guyana an attitude that electoral politics or elections not only a necessary step for a flourishing democracy, but some people regard it as the only step. So I think it's a big mistake. I think what we should be talking about is a system of governance which goes from the top right down to the bottom. A system in which all groups, all interest groups, and more particularly civil society, empowers itself and is empowered to play an active role. I believe part of the problem of our present condition is I don't want to use a gender-sensitive word like emasculation, but really, in a certain sense, the loss of influence of civil society in the governance of our country at all levels. And I would like to see some national position on the role of civil society in getting us out of this impasse. I will rest there for the time being, but I would like to speak a lot about civil society.
Excellent. David, the problem seems intractable. Is it really? Is it without solution?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that human beings have a duty to confront problems that they face. And we are no different from any other society in the world in that we face problems, serious problems. And I think our problem has been that we have not paid enough attention to those problems, and that we have sought to get around them and skirt around them rather than confront them. Your question at the beginning was, how did we get where we are today? And I think the reason that we have really descended that slippery slope that Rashleigh talks about is that we have neglected to really recognize that we were on a slippery slope to begin with, and to try to find that resting place. I think we passed up so many opportunities since independence to find that resting place, to find a point which we can say, look, there are some baggage that we brought with us, historical baggage, and that if we don't deal with these baggages, then we could find ourselves really going down the drain. And we refuse to deal with them in an open and honest way. And so therefore we are where we are today. But I think that we have a duty. I certainly believe that my generation, more than Mr. Jackson's generation, has a duty to really stand up and be counted, to really save this nation, because that is the point that we have arrived at, a point where the nation has to be saved. And I think that
like a rescue operation.
that's the rescue operation. And I think that is the challenge before us. And I don't think, as terrible as the problems are, I don't think that we should give up. I think that there's hope somewhere.
All right. Clearly, depending on who you talk to, and that is one of the things that this study brings out, in as much as we obviously share the same space, it is clear that we have a different perception of the reality that occurs in that space. And in a real sense, the search for a solution seems to have to deal with the fact that we are here listening to the same songs but hearing different things. How do we treat with that in a general sense? Why should, yes?
I think in a certain sense, David has pointed to one way, that is recognizing the nature of your problem and the origin of the problem. But I would like to expand on that a little bit. I think that in this country, we spend so much time trying to find blame for our own mistakes or our own misdemeanors. I mean, one knows there's no shortage of candidates to blame in terms of our present condition. We can start from the colonial government. You can talk about the periods of Dr. Jagan when he was premier. You can talk about Forrest Burnham when he was prime minister and president. Then you can speak of Mr. Hoyt when he was president, of Dr. Jagan when he was president, Mrs. Jagan when she was president, Sam Hinds when he was president, and now Mr. Jagder when he's president. But that is getting us nowhere. I think having recognized, we must first understand what it is, where it is we went wrong, and try to work for a consensual position so how we get from where we are. First of all, understanding how we got there, but how we get from where we are to where we want to go. And that to me is the big thing that's lacking in this country. You open the newspapers, all you read is about who did what to who. As if because you were more corrupt than I am, that corruption is a good thing. You know, there's no outright condemnation of corruption. And there doesn't seem to be a national desire to really grapple with corruption. I mean, as one example, you know, I noticed Bishop Singh recently, in his letter to the faithful, talks about the need to condemn violence. Now, that is one thing, but you know, violence has causes, and unless you treat with the causes, you're going to be treating with symptoms. And I think our society is in a state of potential disrepair beyond reproach, that we can't afford to be dealing only with symptoms. We have to deal with fundamental issues. So I think really, for me, if we can not put the past behind you and forget it, but understand what the past meant, because the past has some good lessons which you mustn't throw away, you know, but you must recognize the pitfalls of the past.
Let us start right there. David, what does that past, what are some of these lessons that Rashleigh talked about?
The lessons of the past, I think the big lesson of the past, and Rashleigh touched on it at the very beginning, is that consensus and compromise, given the nature of our society, is very important if we're going to move forward. That we live in a multiracial society, a society that is segmented along racial lines, and in a certain sense what we have are two, if you will, free nations struggling to come together as a nation. And in order for that to happen, we have to develop a culture of compromise, a culture of consensus, a culture of togetherness. And I think if we can learn anything from the past, is that whenever we have attempted to do that, we have always had some breathing space. But that has been more the exception than the rule. So that we want, if we are going to move forward, to make that the rule, that we understand that this space belongs to us. We understand that we have deep differences, but we understand that we are here and we for all intents and purposes, we remain here. And so that we've got to make this place a place that is habitable for all of us, so that 53% of one race does not say things are good and 16% say that things are good, or 80-something percent say things are bad. We must reach the point where we can both sit down and say, look, we will try to make things better. So I think that the big lesson that we've got to learn from the past is that when we cooperate, when we compromise, when we strive for consensus, that's really the opening for the flowering of our nation.
All right. The way in which we
Could I
evolve.
add something?
Yes,
Could I say
sure.
something? I have a personal view. I mean, I haven't researched anything, but it's more like a hunch that the rise of mass political parties in this country has had both good and bad effects. And we haven't really examined what have been the bad effects of the rise of mass political parties. For one thing, I think that they have captured all the space and they've left very little space for citizens and for citizens in groups as individuals and groups to operate in their best interests. So I would see one of the things to be done is to look at the nature of the operations of political parties to see whether in fact they have not garnered too much space and whether some space should not be recaptured by civil society. I mean, after all, the Constitution says that sovereignty rests in the people, not in the political parties, not in the government. Sovereignty rests with the people. And it seems to me that the people must empower themselves and be empowered. The government and the political parties will have to create an environment in which people can proceed with self-empowerment. You know, in other words, that I mean, if you're looking from the point of view of democracy, I mean, I don't know if the University of Guyana or some student has examined the constitutions of all our political parties to see whether they have vestiges of anti-democratic principles, you know, embedded in some of their provisions. And whether all these organizations that are there, whether their constitutions, their rules and regulations are democratic. In other words, if in our organizations or institutions we don't practice democracy, we don't allow democracy to flourish, then we can't expect it suddenly to emerge at the national level.
It's interesting. The word democracy has been used here, starting with me, and you've used it and you've used it. Let's for 1 minute take an aside and explore what democracy really means. I've heard many times people talking about 1992 being a benchmark year for the return of democracy and all such nonsense. And I would like, who would like to take this? Let us explore this phenomenon of democracy.
But you know, that term democracy is so widely used and it has thousands of meanings, I would say. But the definition of democracy that I like to use is a situation where the people in a society make the decisions that affect them. That is, all of the people in the society make the decisions that affect them. And so therefore, democracy for me must mean wide participation of the vast majority of people in the decision-making process. Whatever the mechanism must make allowances for the people to be part of that decision-making. Now, our experience here in Guyana has never been a democratic experience. From slavery through colonialism, through the post-colonial era, we have not had, it's been an authoritarian culture, an authoritarian system. We have flirted with democracy, but we have not put in place democracy. That 1992 was not the restoration of democracy, because there was never democracy. 1992 saw the return of free and fair elections, or the prospect of free and fair elections. But what we've had since 1992 is that democracy has been on trial since 1992 as it has never been before. Because with the return of free and fair elections, we've had to deal with the whole question of governance. If one party, which represents mainly one race, wins an election with 52%, and then rules and takes the entire government in this winner-take-all system, and shuts out the party or parties that win 48% of the vote, then that's not democracy. Because 48% of the people do not have a chance to participate in the decision-making process. So in a sense, the free and fair elections that we thought that would have led to the falling of democracy is really leading to the institution or the reinstitution of this rabid authoritarianism that we have been accustomed to in the past. So I would like to say that this period is from 1992 to the present, is a period of great uncertainty, but it's led with the authoritarian past.
I rather like the introduction by David of the concept of decision-making, participation, decision-making, full participation of people, and really what I would call the democratization of decision-making. That is making decision-making more democratic. That to me is going to be the essence of a flourishing democracy. When decision-making is democratic, not decision-making on the national level, but at all levels. Recently, I had occasion to read the rule, I can't remember what it's called, the rules and regulations, when the ex-slaves bought Plantation Norfolk, now called it Victoria. They drew up rules as to how they will govern themselves. You know, they would have an elected committee to run. They had a system of fines. You know, if somebody was caught on somebody else's provision farm, the committee had the powers to fine. And it's only when they couldn't settle conflict among themselves that it turned to the central mechanisms for conflict resolution. Now, I don't think we can replicate that in itself, but the ideas are there. That is of people empowering themselves, you know, and of democracy being the democratization. What we're really talking about is the democratization of decision making. And we can't discuss it in Guyana without discussing what is happening in the world outside.
Yes,
because the world outside is most undemocratic. The G8.
Yes, yes.
That's right. Yes.
And the all the international institutions of the World Bank and the IMF. And where democracy prevails, we are told that you have the tyranny of the majority, you know, like at the United Nations.
You know, it's interesting to hear you two, experienced, learned gentlemen, your views with regard to this concept of democracy. Where the second half of the second pillar of Archivist, I think, tries to remind us that is people believing that they are participating, apart from and in addition to the first plank, which talks to the representation of people, their larger numbers should their vote should count in that circumstance. But it's interesting, when the people were polled on this same question, this is what that study indicated. Only 41% of the population was satisfied with the winner-take-all system of governance. This, no doubt, was composed of the majority of the 29% of respondents who favored the PPP and the 25% who favored the PNC. Just note how low those numbers really are to govern them, as opposed to the 35% of the respondents who favored some form of coalitional formula. So if you were to put that question to the test, in an empirical sense, for the first time, we have the people saying this is as close to a referendum as we have ever had on this issue. The people are saying, the majority of them are saying, the plurality of them are saying, we need some shared, a coalitional formula to deal with this question of how we govern ourselves. Now, on that point, David, the smaller parties have all literally, the WPA, the TUF, and the host of others, have come out in an unambiguous way supporting the concept of some shared governance. The PNC did not subscribe to the concept of shared governance until the last days before the 2000 elections, when in their manifesto, it expressly made provision and said, all this involves consciously moving away from the traditional winner-take-all approach, which dictates the objectives of public life and governance at national and regional levels in our multi-ethnic society. We still have, we can't say in an unambiguous way that the party, as it expresses itself in the public domain, is totally and wholly committed to the concept of the dispensing of the winner-take-all model. The PPP, for its part, unlike the others, has said categorically they are quite happy with the 1980 Constitution as we fiddled with it coming out of the post-Hardmanston discussions that led to some changes to some rather non-essential issues which affect the heart and soul of this whole question of social cohesion, which is so essential for national growth and development. What is your take on this, David? Where do you see us going from here? Because at the end of the day, I think what we are all saying is that Rashleigh said the political parties have almost assumed the fullness of the space that is available. Mm-hmm. It seems as if we are not going to be able to bring about this, the realization of what the people said in the Sarah study, what we suspect, we thought intuitively should be an approach to governance. But the major political parties, the PPP and the PNC, which control nearly 90% of the votes of this country, the electorate, they are not unambiguously saying that we need to revisit winner-take-all as an option.
When Rashleigh spoke earlier about the nature of political parties and mass political parties, I think he's onto something. Those parties were change agents during the anti-dictatorial struggle. They were the lifeline. They fought for change. In the post-colonial era, they've degenerated. They're no longer change agents. They see power as an end in itself. So therefore, their embrace or lack of embrace of a concept, of an issue, is all tied in as to whether that will carry them to power or not. So that individuals in the leadership may subscribe to a particular concept. They may subscribe to things that we feel should be obvious. But once it comes down to the question of contention for power, they will only advance those things if those things will take them to victory. And victory within our present circumstances and our present configuration means victory and winner taking all. So that everything that the PNC will make statements like these, but in the final analysis, if it does not fit in to this whole scheme of powers and end in itself, then they don't pursue it. I therefore believe that we have to separate people's electoral support for these parties. We have to separate that because we know the electoral support for these parties are based on racial security. Indians feel that they must vote for the PPP to secure them against Africans, and Africans feel they must vote for the PNC to secure them against Indians. You see? But in the final analysis, I think people are concerned about where they are in their villages. They see there that they're not part of decision making. They feel the poverty, they see the poverty, and so their response to that is the response that you're seeing there. That 40% of the people, or 50% of the people feel that they are not part of the decision making process. So I therefore feel that we need a campaign that targets the ordinary people, seeking to empower them to struggle for a part in the decision-making process. And I like to call it I call it a kind of vertical sharing of governance, so that people in their villages and their towns share the governance with the central government. Because at the central government, they must elect their representatives. But in their villages, they are there and they must make decisions. And that those decisions must carry equal weight with the decision making at the top.
Well, that's very interesting, but I would like to take a slightly hopeful tone in that all that you say is right. But I seem to believe that within recent times, um, the leadership of both the PDP and the PNC are talking about, they use a new buzzword, inclusiveness. You see, I regard power sharing and inclusiveness as buzzwords. Right? Now, the thing is that I believe that in addition to pressure from the people, there are tendencies within the parties, probably more in one than the other, that are working in favor of a change from the winner take all philosophical political position. So I think we can see movement coming from two sides, one within parties and one from outside of parties. But I do agree with you that I think perhaps also that the use of the word power sharing has helped to drive certain political leaders into bunkers. You know, because if your concept is that power comes through the vote, through the elections, then they are bunkered in the view that I can only win power through the vote, and therefore it must be winner take all. But I think there are new tendencies within the society and within at least some of the parties, whereby people who are looking at the picture from a different lens are beginning to see that calling for what you want, power sharing inclusiveness, that the future of this country lies in a different form of governance. How shared, I don't know. You actually went so far as to say about equal at the local and the central level. But some different kind of arrangement for governance that gives, and I really like the phrase, gives the people meaningful participation in decision making. So I would say that we have to work for the democratization of decision making in the society at the top level down to the bottom level. You know, and I'll come back to this. The other thing, along with that, I would like to see an emergent and proactive civil society. You know, because I have a definition of civil society here, which I really like. First of all, the concept of civil society implies that there's a defense of human society at the national level against the power of the state and the inequities of the marketplace. Then another one says civil society is the space between the state and the individual, where those habits of the heart flourish to socialize the individual and humanize the state. So I think we need a kind of civil society that is going to work in these directions that we are talking about. A civil society that is concerned about social cohesion, about the intensification of democratization within the society, about excesses in terms of state violence, about corruption. You see, so many organizations have become complicit or see their interests lie in silence or complicity. That the role for civil society is made even stronger. I mean, let me give you an example. Say, for instance, say the Private Sector Commission. I mean, we know that the future of Guyana is in jeopardy because of two great things in relation to population. One is out-migration, and the other is HIV/AIDS. Now, I would like to see the Private Sector Commission be active on the question of, say, HIV/AIDS, because if that is not halted, the workforce in the private sector is going to be, if more people want to leave, then they won't have skills. So it's in the interest of the private sector, if they regard themselves as a member of civil society, to be interested in that. The other thing I would say is that insofar as the government makes international commitments on behalf of the people, it is for the people in their various forms, civil society and whatnot, to ensure that the government lives up to those commitments. For instance, the government has adopted, along with other CARICOM governments, a charter of civil society. Among it, it says the state undertakes or states undertake to establish within their respective states a framework for genuine consultations among the social partners in order to reach common understandings on and support for the objectives, contents, and implementation of national economic and social programs and their respective roles and responsibilities in good governance. Now, we have done nothing about making sure the government honors this in Guyana. You know, similarly, it says that the state shall establish a national committee or designate a body to monitor and ensure the implementation of this charter, and the national committee or body shall comprise so. What I'm saying, there are large areas for action whereby people can recapture some space and thereby empower themselves by making the process of decision making more democratic and more participatory.
Yes. You know, Rashleigh, you indicated, and clearly, I think both of the major political parties in the run-up to the elections and after have spoken and have sought to convince us that they had a commitment to inclusiveness. I think everybody says that they wish to run a more inclusive government. For some, and/or parties, as the case might be, because we recognize that the parties what form the government and the same thinking which carries through them. For some, the selection of persons who represent the diversity is an act of inclusiveness. Without necessarily carrying with it the representation of absolute representation of the body politic, the views of all of the people involved. That has been one approach to inclusiveness, which I think it is fair to say
I don't
has
think
not worked.
No, not at all.
There is a recent approach, a rather positive one, coming out of some recent developments where the leader of the opposition, Mr. Hoyt, and the president, Mr. Jagdeo, have been engaged in a dialogue which would seek to have a number of issues considered to be essential to the return to a state of some normalcy. And it's now taking on form of the bipartisan discussions. Committees have been set up to deal with various issues. Now, the two approaches that we just mentioned, one, the isolated selection of specific representatives without any basis of what in fact they are carrying behind them in terms of what they represent. Then on the other hand, the discussion between the political leaders and a commitment to bipartisan resolution of issues, specific issues identified as being important. These are clearly interesting approaches to inclusion, but do you think they can solve our problems here?
Well, I don't put much credence to the first one. They're picking out a few people and setting them up there. I think the second one is one that we can work with. I see it as part of a process. But it is not something that we must sit on. It's not an end in itself. I think this is a process. And I see the whole committee thing as a process. Already, within a few weeks, we see the contradiction. And the contradictions is
Not all.
so some of them. Who makes the decision? Comes back to the whole question of decision making. All right? You set up a framework for shared, if you will, decision making. Yet in the final analysis, constitutionally and also in practice,
kind of settle for democratic.
democratic governance, we find that one party makes decisions, so we have two decisions. And so therefore the contradictions come out. I'm saying when these contradictions arise, we must move to another stage. All right? And so therefore I think that the dialogue is important, but it is not enough. We must move, and
Necessary but not sufficient.
not sufficient. All right? It must move, and things have to move at a certain pace. Because what is happening is the society is disintegrating at a very swift pace. And so therefore, we have to, as we enter into these new areas, and the experiences begin to unfold, we must be prepared to make even bolder decisions. It is my view that given the fact that we have not developed a democratic culture, we have not developed a culture of consensus in this country, that we've got to institute constitutional arrangements that would guarantee that we behave in this way. You see, in the Westminster model in England and so forth, the parties can make this gentleman's agreement because there's a culture that says that, we must be inclusive and so on. And we must not only say we're inclusive, but we must be seen to be inclusive. We don't have that culture here. Yeah? We've got to develop that culture here. And until we have consolidated that culture of consensus and compromise, we've got to put in place the necessary mechanisms so that we can think. For example, if the agreements between Mr. Hoyt and Mr. Jagdio were part of statutes, that is, if something was taken, a bill to that effect was taken to Parliament, and Parliament puts a stamp on it, it becomes a statute, it becomes law, then they'll be compelled to behave in a certain way. Mr. Jagdio and Mr. Hinds could not do one thing on one hand, and they agreed with Mr. Hoyt to do something on the other hand. All right? So they shouldn't do it. But they can do it because we don't have that culture, and two, because there's no constitutional mechanism to force them to do it. So we've got to move from the stage now of the dialogue to constitutional mechanism that brings about inclusiveness, power sharing, shared governance, but brings about that democratization of decision making.
Could I have another dimension? Sure. A couple of weeks ago, I had to talk to a group of people, and they had like a cultural show at the beginning, and one of the songs was sung, which really moved me because the children, before they sang Rashleigh, was born in the land of mighty Orion. Now, I think in a certain sense, we have lost our moorings about what is a nation. I don't listen to the radio as often as I used to, but I don't get the impression that people are saying patriotic things and singing patriotic songs as they used to at one time. In fact, I said that to the group that I was speaking, that when I heard the song, I was moved because sometime before that, I was talking to someone and I was saying, we used to sing so lusty, onward, upward, may we ever go. And the person said, but children now, they will sing, onward, outward, we will never go. Yes. What I'm saying is that kind of thought is a reflection of the reality.
Yes. David, whenever this concept of shared governance, and as I say, and I think we'd all agree, unfortunately, I think everyone's radars have been stuck on power sharing, which automatically sends the wrong signals. People are talking about, been working hard politically, the time has come now to share the spoils, and we're not sharing that with anybody else. But committed as clearly, I think the focus of this discussion and what the country at large, I think, what they're saying is that we want to feel that we are participating in the decision making in this country. Now, that is the thrust. When both of the principal political parties are asked, why do you not think that this is the way to go? One answers and says, show me a way, tell me of a model. I do not understand how it can be done. The other one says, just like the other one says, we don't think that it is possible to share this thing.
We just won the election.
But of course,
and we have a mandate.
Secondly, he used of that is the fact that we have a mandate.
Yes.
We have won an election.
Now, David, but neither party has a mandate to break up the country.
I think that is the point that is not made loud enough. That is the point that is not really made well enough and loud enough. Neither party has a mandate to break this country up. And really, I've heard David make comments some time ago about the categories of persons who are coming out of this process. One of the last category I heard him talk about was what? Disillusioned peacemakers?
Yes.
Disillusioned peacemakers. Now, I wonder if for the rest of this program, we could attempt to focus on what models, what kinds of approaches we can have to setting up this kind of structure that allows one to move to healthier state of greater participation, shared governance in this country? Can you think of any institutional arrangements? What constitutional engineering needs to be put in place?
Well, as I mentioned before, what I call the vertical sharing of power, or sharing of governance, that is the sharing of governance between the people in their own community and the representatives of the central government. Like that, equal weight should be given to the decisions. Now, in the real world, we wouldn't find that. We have to struggle for that. But some kind of sharing of the governance, that people in their villages must be able to make decisions on what happens to the drainage and the irrigation, what happens to education in their villages, what happens to their roads and so forth. They must have decisions. They must contribute to the decisions on that and share those decisions with the central government, so that somebody doesn't come into your village and say, we will pay your road every 5 years.
Yeah, but David, in realistic terms, the way the thing currently operates, even at the level of local government elections, the party machinery is very much at work. You would find operatives of the two principal parties in just about every municipality and or village across this country. How does one then...
I don't want to defend any party or any party I can't, because, but I think that if you look at the record in terms of the last local government elections, it isn't true that the part that the both major parties fought in everything. That one party left it to the local people.
Right. And the PNC did do a lot of that, left it to the local people. But I see the point you're making.
No, and I agree.
Right. And correcting is for the record. And that is why I advocate in going back to the village council, going back to the villages as the primary unit of local government. And so once you go back to the villages, then you have to you won't have to import people from outside the villages to deal with the village problem. The people there, the farmers, the housewives, the workers of the village, in spite of their political differences,
as the people of Victoria did in 1839.
Yes, they know what their problems are. They know that they have to take care of the canals. They know that they have to take care of drainage to bring so that they can do their farming and so on. And they know that political differences have to go out of the way when you're dealing with bread and butter issues. So I think it will introduce a new culture.
So, for instance, don't want to cut you. I think we've got the point there. In terms of Georgetown municipality here, should we have a PPP slate, a GGG slate, PNC slate, as we currently see in Georgetown, just not going anywhere?
But I don't think we can avoid that. In the ideal world, I would like to avoid that.
You might have an interim thing in between two, and that is voting by wards.
By wards, yes.
Right. So, in fact, what you're advocating then,
Rashleigh... I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying it is a possibility, right?
Yeah.
In terms of what your question, one possibility is you can still have the party running, but then the seats are not allocated based on party lists, but on the basis of the choice of the voters in a particular ward.
Exactly.
Yes. You see, therefore the party has to put up somebody in the ward who will attract the votes in the ward.
So, so we move to the ward system. That's a possibility.
That's one possibility.
Yeah, you see, we're not going to get rid of political parties. But what we have to do is to make the people themselves take charge of their own, affairs, even if they do so through the party. But they take charge of their own affairs. So that the party is not the beginning and the end of everything. You have empowerment from the bottom. Okay?
You can have people from the cradle to the grave. What a legal
Yes. Since we live in a representative system, a representative quote-unquote democratic system, where people must elect their representatives to the central government, I think we have to look at some kind of shared governance at the level of the central government. And I think at the executive, that is the cabinet level, that's where power lies in our system. And at that level, I am proposing what I call...
Like they're on the Central Committee Department.
Well, the party raises its head everywhere. But I would like to join with those others who are proposing a kind of multi-person executive or multi-person president. And the kind of thing that I've been playing around with is a system where the party that gains the most votes gets the presidency. The second most votes, the party gets the vice presidency or prime minister position. And then if there is a third party that gets at least 10 to 15% of the vote, that party gets the vice or deputy prime ministership. And that these three officers form what is called the presidency. That each of them has a veto. So the decisions must be made by all three of them. All three of them must get together and appoint the cabinet. All three of them must get together and approve bills passed or veto bills passed by the National Assembly. At that level, that the person who holds the presidency will be the Minister of Defense, that the person who holds the prime ministership will be the Minister of National Security and Home Affairs, as they call it, and that the third person holds the position of Minister of Economic Development or like that. So that the three important areas, usually three contentious areas in any cabinet, are held are held at the top. And so you have this three-person presidency, and that they come together and work together, and that the cabinet is divided in proportion to the votes by the party. Now, of course, you introduce all kinds of problems there, as they would like to see. They say introduce gridlock and introduce all these things. But I think that when we look at our concrete situation, when we look at the fact that we have been gridlocked since 1955, we've been most gridlocked since 1997, I don't think we can do worse. So that when you have that kind of sharing of decision making, again, you're right, power sharing may send the wrong signal. When you have the sharing of decision making at the top, what you do is you lower the temperature at the bottom. The people at the bottom, Africans who now, 84% of them feel that they're not represented in the decision making process, cannot make that same kind of charge now because they will be represented in the decision making process. Of course, that will not solve our problem.
But the detractors say that you will now be creating a situation there is no opposition.
Well,
how do you answer that?
My answer to that is that we don't need opposition in these countries. I think what opposition has meant here in Guyana, it has meant destabilization of the government in power. It has mean holding back your services from the government. In most cases, the government don't want it. But I mean, it has meant
It's also meant your supporters don't get work.
your supporters don't get work, marginalization, and so on. The government has meant witch hunting, marginalizing half of the population. So this government opposition thing really doesn't work here. Look, in England, in true Westminster, opposition means government in waiting. That Labour knows that it will rule, but as Mr. Blair said recently, Labour must say to itself that at some point someone will have to lead the party into opposition. No, they can say that in England because of the kind of system that operates here. Here we cannot say the same thing. Opposition does not mean government in waiting. So I think that this whole thing about opposition is not needed. Where the opposition will come is in the parliament, because you democratize the parliament. You make the parliament into a real representative body. You make the parliament into a check on the cabinet. So the parliament becomes the opposition to the cabinet. And in this system that I am talking about, the members of the executive, that is, members of the cabinet, do not sit in parliament. So they sit in parliament in terms of introducing bills and participating, but they don't vote. So that they're not able to influence what goes on in parliament by the vote. So the parliament, what I call the people's parliament, becomes the opposition. And in terms of the civil society, I'm advocating that we have an upper house, what I call the House of Civil Society, where members of civil society gather and form an upper house and have the authority to revise bills that are passed by the lower house, and to have a suspensory veto where they can hold on to a bill for 3 months and force the society to engage in a discussion on this bill and force it back to the parliament process. So that kind of system we're talking in is a sharing of decision making. The decision making takes place at the level of the presidency, at the level of the cabinet, and that if the cabinet cannot arrive at a decision, then the matter is thrown to the parliament to arrive at a decision. So you have different poles of decision making, and you have one branch of government serving as a check or quote unquote opposition to the other branch of government. I think that is the kind of system that I would advocate in the present circumstances.
Excellent. Rashleigh,
No, my comment is he obviously has given a lot of thought to this issue, which I haven't.
And you do like that.
No, I rest my thing on the general. Yeah, I agree with the idea that words convey images, and as I say, if your concept of power is when you win the election, then power sharing is a negative idea, or it brings negative vibes. So really, if you really advance the concept of democratizing decision making and having various checks and balances along the lines that David has said, I'm not necessarily endorsing every single thing, but the approach, the approach, I think, because the objective, I'm applauding the objective because I share that objective, but I'm not an expert on constitutions and so on, and I wouldn't venture into pieces.
Thank you very much, Rashleigh. David, quick 1 minute.
I would like to challenge the Guyanese people to rise up. And when I say rise up, I don't mean go out there and start burning tires and beating up people.
Or roaring.
Or roaring. I want to challenge the Guyanese people to take their own destiny, to take the destiny in their own hands, and to recognize that in the final analysis, leaders will lead. But the atmosphere and the conditions that you create will determine the quality of leadership that you get. So that you must begin in your own communities to provide the leadership and to create an atmosphere for a kind of shared governance in this space that we call Guyana.
Rashleigh?
I would just, as a final comment, like to make a plea for us as a nation to recognize the legitimacy of struggle, depending upon the conditions. I well remember that when many African states or many African nations were fighting for their independence, they sought to negotiate, but in the end, they found they had to use arms. So that we must recognize that if conditions are such, if people feel it necessary to protest and to demonstrate, that those actions are legitimate. And that what we must do as a nation is to really analyze the causes that make those people take such action. Because basically, I find the Guyanese people are peaceful people. And what they want is to be able to enjoy the fruits of a good life, and they feel that whatever the resources are, that those resources should be equitable, shared among the people. So that along with shared decision making, there must be a shared distribution of the resources of the country.
On that note, you have been looking at Spotlight. Our guests tonight have been Mr. Rashleigh Jackson, former minister in the PNC government with responsibility for foreign affairs, and Dr. David Hinds, lecturer in political science and political commentator. I am Grantley Waldron. Good night.
Oh, well. It was good going down memory lane, sitting there next to Rashleigh Jackson and sharing that space with him and reflecting on this issue of democracy. A lot of those thoughts, I think, are still relevant today. I think that interview was done. Mr. Hoyt was still alive, so it would have been done between 2001 and 2002. I rather think it was in 2001. So it's about 22 years ago that we had been exploring this issue of a political solution for Guyana and what to do about power. In 2002, just before he died, Mr. Hoyt came out for shared governance. He said shared governance was an idea whose time had come. Unfortunately, he died in December of 2002, and so was not able to push the issue. Ever since, the PNC has been engaging the issue. Mr. Corbyn engaged the issue. And when Mr. Corbyn was not successful in striking a deal with the PPP for shared governance with that party, he then resorted to shared governance with other parties. And so was born the APNU, which was, in a sense, a first step towards shared governance. Coalition politics came to power in 2015. Mr. Granger, to his credit, held out the olive branch to the PPP for talks towards a shared governance. The PPP rejected it on the grounds that they were not going to negotiate with Nagamutu, who was appointed by Mr. Granger to be the point person. The rest, as we know, is history. But as we have said, the jury's still out. What kind of democratic governance is best for Guyana? I am still a power sharer. I'm still a shared governance person. I still believe ultimately, if we are going to move our country from where it is now to this prosperous place, to this place where all of us who came from different places to make Guyana our home, that all of us can live here in peace, all of us can live here sharing equitably in the resources of this country, but we have to do so with a culture of sharing and a practice of sharing. I still believe so. But as I've argued before, in recent times, that the biggest obstacle to democratic governance, shared democratic governance in Guyana, is the PPP. And so for us to democratize governance in Guyana, the PPP has to be removed from government, clearing the way for a movement towards sharing of governments. Ultimately, we are not going to be able to bring about a democratic governance in this country without the PPP. The PPP represents half of the electorate of this country. Whether we like their leaders or not is not the issue. The issue is that people elect them to represent them, just as people elect the PNC and other so-called opposition parties to represent them. We cannot tell people who they must elect. And so at some point, the PPP has to deal with the PNC and opposition groups if we're going to become a democratic society, and the PNC and other opposition groups will have to deal with the PPP. But I think the obstacle to that is the PPP that believe it and it alone should govern this country. And on the basis of that, they're disqualified from opening up the space for shared democratic governance. So we've got to remove them. We've got to vote them out of office to then create the conditions for sharing of the responsibilities of governance. I want to thank you all for, again, sharing the time with me. And I'll be back tomorrow. But I hope Rashleigh Jackson and I, that we have given you some food for thought. We have given you some food for thought. I'll be back tomorrow night when we come again to engage the struggle. Until then, as usual, love is our watchword.